Let's bring you more analysis now. Joining us live is Dr. Malcolm Davis. He's a senior analyst in defence strategy at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Malcolm, appreciate your time as always. Firstly, how do you expect things will change over the next 24 hours? What happens next?
Look, I think what we're seeing is an initial stage of a major invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So they've moved forces into the Russian-held areas of the Donbas, called the Luhansk and the Donetsk areas. The next step would be to expand their invasion into the Ukrainian-held areas of the Donbas. And that's where we're likely to see intense fighting break out between Ukrainian and Russian forces. And then the key question after that is, do they then at the same time launch an advance from the north, from Belarus towards Kyiv? And secondly, in the south, potentially including an amphibious operation to seize Mariupol and Odessa. And certainly I think the expectation and all the indicators and warnings are that the Russians will undertake a massive invasion of Ukraine, taking substantial chunks of territory, including the capital, Kyiv.
How well equipped is Ukraine to defend itself against Russia?
They are certainly better equipped now than what they were in 2014 when Russia invaded and annexed Crimea and launched a proxy war against the Ukrainian government in the Donbas. They've had a number of years to actually prepare for this essentially re-invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And so they are far better trained, they're better experienced, they have better weapons. And certainly NATO is providing military support to the Ukrainians in the form of shoulder-fired weapons such as the Javelin anti-tank guided weapon and shoulder-fired missiles to attack aircraft. But the reality is that no matter how well prepared the Ukrainians are, the Russians have an absolute advantage in overwhelming firepower in terms of artillery, surface-to-surface missiles and rockets, massive armor capability, and of course air power. And so this is going to be very bloody indeed. And I certainly think that this is the worst military crisis facing Europe, certainly since the end of the Cold War and potentially since the end of the Second World War.
Malcolm, you mentioned NATO. How has the expansion of NATO led us to this point, if at all?
It has not. I think that the notion that somehow NATO expansion has created this crisis is absolutely incorrect. States in Eastern Europe after the end of the Cold War sought to join NATO for protection from Russia. They were not forced to join NATO by NATO states. It was a willing decision on the part of those states, such as the Baltic states, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech and Slovak republics, and so on, Romania, to actually seek protection through NATO from what they still saw as an aggressive Russia. And they were clearly correct. Russia clearly hasn't changed from the days of the Soviet Union in terms of its territorial ambitions. So I don't buy into the whole notion that somehow this is all NATO's fault. That's the argument that Putin is putting out, but I think that it's completely incorrect.
And when you talked about the Cold War, what do you make of the characterisation we've seen from some that this is essentially Cold War Mark II between Russia and the West?
Well, I think it's an interesting idea in the sense that however this crisis turns out, Europe's security future has taken a massive turn for the worse as a result of Russia's actions. And NATO now is going to have to get serious about its primary role, which is to deter Russian threats to Europe and to defend Europe if those threats do emerge. And that is why you are seeing essentially NATO states reinforcing the eastern frontiers in the Baltic states, in Poland, in Hungary, in Romania. I think that when you think back to the Cold War days, the front line was very much the Fulda Gap and the North German Plain. Now the front line is the Suwałki Gap in Poland, and it's the Baltic states, and it's Romania and the Black Sea. And we have to start realizing that we are in for potentially decades of a return to Cold War style confrontation in Europe. And the notion that somehow we have seen the end of history, and the notion that major power war simply will not happen, I think is completely false. It's disproven by Putin's actions now.
And so what role do you see Australia playing in all of this? Obviously, we've just heard from the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, that we will also be imposing sanctions on Russia, joining our Western allies in doing that. Australia, obviously, a minor player in terms of economic trade and that sort of thing. But in terms of an Australian role, where are we at?
Look, we are an observer, a partner to NATO. We're not a NATO state. But we are a partner to NATO, so we do have obligations there in terms of supporting NATO states. And I believe we're doing the right thing in terms of enforcing sanctions on Russia. Those sanctions have to increase in severity over time as Russia expands its invasion of Ukraine. So we have to do the same thing, and we have to be prepared to impose sweeping waves of sanctions that are ever more intense and more stinging on Russia, not just economic sanctions, but political and diplomatic sanctions as well, to really drive the message home to Putin that this sort of behaviour is unacceptable and will not be allowed to he won't be allowed to get away without cost in this. So I think Australia has a really important diplomatic and economic role to play here, as well as a security role in terms of working with our NATO partners and preventing Russia from thinking it can get away with further adventurism in Europe.
Dr. Malcolm Davis, we do always appreciate you sharing your time with us with your analysis. Thank you so much.
Thank you.